When last we left thee, Henry V were at war with France and winning at Agincourt. In fact, he won spectacularly, and mostly with just peasants. Finally, the King of France sued for peace. He had no choice since Henry V were destroying him. After months of negotiation, the Treaty of Troyes was signed in 1420, making Henry V the heir apparent to the French throne. And Henry was subsequently married to Charles VI's eldest daughter, Catherine of Valois. He immediately sets to see about rule number 2, to produce his one and only heir. Yay, peace! No, it does not last. Why? Well, the French king already had an heir, and he is not happy to be set aside. Henry V has to go right back to France to defend his lands against the Dauphin. Unfortunately, Henry V died while in France, possibly from heat stroke, as he had spent the last day riding in full plate armour in the heat. Henry V did not live to be crowned King of France, and the French King Charles VI survived him by 2 months. His son, Henry VI, becomes king. Unfortunately, he's not even a year old. This means a regency, again, but an incredibly long regency. And his mother is the regent. But she's French. Honestly, a lot could go wrong here. Parliament passed a law that said she could not remarry without the consent of the king. He would be unable to give that consent until he were an adult, though. That's a rather cruel thing to say, the least. Catherine of Valois were a widow at the age of 21, and Parliament tried to tell her she could not marry again until she were nearly 40. So she does it anyway. She marries without consent. A Welsh commoner at that. His name, Owen Tudor. Remember that for later. Henry VI found much solace in religion, and he was constantly engaged in meditation and prayer. He attended divine worship, often 2 or 3 times every day. And later, as an adult, he would even complain that he was too often interrupted by affairs of state, and he could now read any of the holy teachings without being disturbed. God forbid he run his own country. Well, Henry were also interested in education. He founded colleges at both Cambridge and Eton. And this were interesting. Even though public disemboweling of criminals were a normal spectacle, Henry abhorred bloodshed, and he frequently intervened to spare the lives of criminals and traitors. He even pardoned nobles who had conspired against his own life. That abhorrence of bloodshed, it honestly tells thee what sort of military leader he were. Not one at all. But in an effort to end the 100 Years' War with France, Henry VI married Margaret of Anjou. But a few years later, he suffers a complete mental breakdown in the summer of 1453. He completely withdrew. He was unable to speak, lift his head, didn't even move a muscle of his own body to help himself. And during this period of insanity, Margaret gave birth to a son, Edward, Prince of Wales. Henry were unable to properly recognise Edward as his heir. And with our king unfit to rule, his cousin, Richard of York, was appointed as protector in March of 1454. York brings government spending under control. He imprisons the king's most hated advisors. Honestly, he's doing a fantastic job. By August, Henry shows some signs of returning to normalcy. But it was not until Christmas that Henry regained his own speech. He expressed complete bewilderment at the birth of his own son, who, he said, must have been conceived by the Holy Ghost. And the important thing is that he did claim Edward as his own son and heir. Now, with Henry having regained his faculties, Richard of York was no longer needed as protector. He was dismissed. Well, honestly, Richard thought he was doing a good job, and very soon the War of the Roses begins. This is where a new player enters the scene. Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick. Warwick is the wealthiest man in all of England, and he wants to use his money to be the power behind a monarch. So he backs York to great success. After many years of fighting between the Lancasters and the Yorks, the Duke of York is made heir to Henry VI. However, Mummy is very unhappy at her son being disinherited. Queen Margaret fights back with her own armies. Both the Duke of York and one of his sons are killed. But Margaret's armies pillage the land as they go, turning the people against the Lancasters. And the Yorkists, led by Richard of York's son, Edward, and the Earl of Warwick, they begin winning. Eventually, Henry VI is set aside, and Edward, the Duke of York, becomes King Edward IV. King Edward IV makes the number one mistake when you depose a king. Henry VI got away. Henry VI and his wife and son are on the run for the next decade. Margaret drums up support anywhere she can. Henry VI, essentially the weakest king England has ever seen, well, he prays. That's not very helpful now, is it? Now, remember Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick? Remember how he backed the House of York because he wanted to be the power behind the throne? Well, Edward IV really doesn't listen to him. And Edward, in fact, tries to rule on his own. He's king. So Warwick changes sides. Warwick knows that Henry VI would essentially be nothing but a puppet. Warwick could certainly be the power behind the throne if Henry VI were back in charge. Well, assuming Queen Margaret allowed that to happen. Henry VI returns from France, and Warwick leads the army along with Henry's son, the Prince of Wales. Edward, the Prince of Wales, is ruthless, violent, cruel, but an absolutely terrible military leader. If he had ever been made king, he would have ruled like a dictator. Well, they win, and the House of Lancaster is restored to the throne again. Now, being who he were, Henry VI were not cut out to make the difficult decisions of being a king. He makes the very same mistake in letting Edward IV get away. Henry VI holds the throne for less than a year. Edward IV gathers enough support to turn the tides once again. Henry VI is captured and imprisoned in the Tower of London, and both Edward, the Prince of Wales, and Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, are subsequently killed in battle. Tradition says that Edward IV killed Warwick personally. Edward wins, takes the throne from Henry again, and this time Edward does not make the same mistake twice. According to an official chronicle that is favourable to Edward IV, Henry died of a broken heart on hearing the news of his son's death. Well, that's a lovely story, but it is suspected that Edward IV had ordered his murder. And as Edward IV were recrowned the morning following Henry's death, yeah, that might have been by his orders. Now, Edward IV may not have made that mistake twice, but he certainly made a big mistake soon after. Do you remember the 2 rules of being a good king? Well, there is another rule about being a good king, and that is that you do not marry for love. Marriages are extremely powerful political tools, and Edward IV could have made some very smart alliances. Instead, he married a commoner in secret. Her name was Elizabeth Woodville. Now, the Woodvilles may not have been titled, but they certainly had money, more than most of the nobles. Elizabeth is also the widow of a Lancastrian supporter. A widow, so not a virgin. Well, that's a problem for royal lineages. They have two sons, Edward and Richard. Edward IV dies suddenly. The causes are unknown, but it is not actually suspected to be foul play. So his son, the Prince of Wales, becomes king. Edward V becomes king at the age of 12. Yay, another regency with a child king. So this regency is headed by his uncle, Richard, the Duke of Gloucester. Richard has a brilliant idea. Do you remember when I said that a queen who is not a virgin might be a problem for royals? Well, Richard uses that. He has his nephews declared illegitimate. Illegitimacy for Edward V leaves Richard as the rightful heir. So Edward V and his brother Richard are known to history as the Princes in the Tower. Their ultimate fate is still unknown. Well, Uncle Richard, now Richard III, also known as the Crookback, had a bit of a deformity. He is a capable administrator, and honestly, he does fairly well as king. But then it all goes wrong. Do you remember Catherine of Valois, the widow of Henry V, who married Owen Tudor, the Welshman? Well, Catherine and Owen had sons. Edmund Tudor married Margaret Beaufort. Well, who are the Beauforts? Let's go back quite a lot. John of Gaunt had a bunch of legitimate children, including Henry IV, as well as a bunch of illegitimate children by his mistress after his wife's death. Henry IV very kindly legitimized his half-siblings. All those half-siblings are known as the Beauforts. John of Gaunt was the third son of Edward III. Richard III, however, is descended from the fourth son. Now, a third son ranks higher than a fourth son. So Henry Tudor, the son of Edmund Tudor and Margaret Beaufort, would rank higher than his cousin, Richard III. And the Tudors had a lot of support, especially from the Lancastrians. He has been raised in France, as England was not safe for Lancastrians. Henry Tudor comes home from France with an army, and he meets Richard III at Bosworth in 1485. Richard III was killed, allegedly by Henry Tudor personally. Henry Tudor is now crowned king, Henry VII. Having been raised on the continent, Henry VII was determined to bring England into the modern era. He laid the groundwork for the Renaissance in England, which eventually happened under his son Henry VIII and Henry's daughter Elizabeth. So officially the Middle Ages ended when Henry VII took the throne. Henry VII marries wisely. He marries Elizabeth of York, the daughter of Edward IV. This officially unites the Lancasters and the Yorks, ending the War of the Roses. Elizabeth of York is both York and Common. Her mother was a Woodville. Henry VII, on the other hand, is French, Welsh, and Lancastrian. Their offspring are French, Welsh, Lancaster, York, and Common. This is unifying. Henry VII is a very capable administrator, but he shuns the spotlight. He recognizes that the English monarchy has suffered over many decades from being poorer than all the rest of the nobility. So he comes up with a brilliant plan to correct that. Now, when nobles are accused of treason or insurrection, they are fined right into the ground. It would not be unusual to screw up and be fined 75% of thy annual income. All that is left is your title, but it's better than being dead. Henry VII starts subsidizing trade and shipbuilding. Why would you give money away? Because he can tax the resultant industry. He is so successful that by the time he passes the throne to his son, the House of Tudor is easily twice as wealthy as the next most wealthy family. He has 4 children. The first is Arthur, Prince of Wales and heir apparent. Arthur was married to Catherine of Aragon, increasing the alliance with Spain. Unfortunately, Arthur died before the marriage was consummated, and Henry VII applies for a papal dispensation from the Pope to annul that marriage. And now he can marry Catherine off to his second son, Henry, the new heir. Why would he do this? Well, money, of course. If Catherine had returned home to Spain, her dowry would have gone with her. Their second child is Margaret, Queen of Scotland. And next is Henry, who would become Henry VIII. And lastly, we have Mary, who would be Queen of France. Henry VII dies in April of 1509. Henry VIII's first act as king was to marry Catherine of Aragon in June 1509. Henry is young, good-looking, sociable. He likes to be in the public eye. He dances, he jousts, he is military, he is religious. In fact, he writes a religious treatise refuting Martin Luther's thesis and is named by the Pope Defender of the Faith. Henry VIII writes his own music. He goes to war with France. While he's in France, his nobles and his wife, Catherine of Aragon, defeat the Scots at Flodden. Later, he sends his younger sister, Mary, to marry the King of France, Louis XII. Less than 3 months later, she were widowed, and Mary had agreed to wed Louis only on the condition that if she survived him, she should marry whom she liked. But Henry didn't want any future marriage to be without his advantage. So Henry VIII sent his friend Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, to bring Mary back to England, and he specifically made the Duke promise he would not propose to her. That did not work out. Charles Brandon and Mary Tudor married while still in France. And technically this was treason, as Charles Brandon had married a royal princess without King Henry's consent. Henry were outraged, and Charles could easily have been executed. Instead, Charles and Mary were heavily fined. Henry is politically astute, and he certainly learned about fines from his father. Right now is the happiest that we will ever be. We have a young, good-looking king, his beautiful wife, their beautiful little daughter. This is a change from the last 200 years. We have entered the Renaissance. Things are definitely looking up for England.